So apparently the people before the moon have a name. They're called the Pelasgians, or the Pelasgians, or I don't know how you pronounce it. I have no idea. You know what I mean? Go look it up. It's spelled on the title. I'm sure it's right there, if I remember to put a title on this show. Why am I talking about these people? So, last time I did a show, or at some point, I don't know when, everything is a haze now. I did a show about a time where there was no moon. Now, I'm perfectly fine with a time of no moon, because if we follow just the basic principles of catastrophism, then no moon is almost assumed. So, in fact, when we were back in the Saturnian configuration, there would have been no moon. Nobody describes a moon at that point. Which then leads us to the next conclusion, that if any historian back in the day is able to talk about people before a moon, that will give those people in the past credibility to whatever they say about the people who were there before the moon. Does that make sense? So basically, there's no reason for the Mediterranean people to talk about a time and a people before there was a moon if there was no time and no people before the moon. Right? There's no reason for them to do that. So this lends some sort of possible credibility towards their story. With this in mind, that means that we might be able to take the sources of anybody who talks about these people more seriously than maybe we would have given them credit for otherwise. So that led me down a new rabbit hole, because I had never really studied anything about the Pelasgians. So I'm cool with no moon. In fact, I'm willing to believe there was no moon before all of this. All the cultures talk about it. Cultures also talk about the people who were back in the day, right? They were there. You know, the people who were very first created. Those people, for sure, would have lived during a time with no moon. So on one hand, we have already been studying about the people during the time with no moon. But we don't always get a very clear picture from this. So what I found interesting is that if you start digging, especially in the Mediterranean area, there's actually a decent picture there. And then I'm going to take some of this information that I learned and we're going to tie it into the other stuff that we know about history, and let's see what we come out with. Because I think this aspect, this Pelagian, whatever, might actually open some doors for us regarding catastrophism. So I'm going to jump into this. I just dug around to find anything I could with respect to this topic. I am not an expert on this. In fact, I am essentially nothing on this. I am just going to show you guys and read what I found, and then let's see if we can't plug this into some of the catastrophism stuff that we know about, which may actually start to explain why these people eventually dropped off the face of the earth. Alright, let's break down what the Pelasgians are. We'll go over what is generally considered the idea of the Pelasgians, and then we will go into other aspects of them from other authors. So, the Pelasgians are a somewhat enigmatic group in Greek mythology and history. Now, they are mentioned in various ancient texts and sources, but there's still a ton of debate about whether or not they actually existed. And this is one of the reasons why I have never paid attention to them, is because I just really haven't seen them mentioned. Or at least they aren't mentioned in the sense that they really truly mattered as much as they apparently probably do matter. So when we read ancient texts or go back and listen to ancient stories and stuff, I swear, there's always like all kinds of names of all kinds of people who migrated from all kinds of places. I mean, there are thousands of these names out there, and I had just lumped in the Pelasgians with the rest of a lot of those names, right? There's a million different names for all these tribes everywhere across the planet. I can't memorize them all. I mean, they might be significant, but unless I have something really pointing to their significance, I have to move on. So whenever I heard anything about the Pelasgians, or rarely ever heard anything about these guys, it was always kind of like in that context. They were just one of many people who were still around, right? Or they were just an ancestor of somebody. Okay, whatever. There's all that kind of situation exists everywhere in history. So what ultimately makes these guys special? Well, they are directly being called the people that existed before the moon. So as a catastrophist, or as just somebody who, is just following real ancient history, This is something we need to pay attention to. Alright, so here is basically what history and mythology have to say about the Pelasgians. So let's start, where did these things even come from? So the identity of the Pelasgians are subject to debate among historians and scholars still. In Greek mythology and in some ancient Greek sources, they are often portrayed as one of the earliest and indigenous peoples of Greece. Now that is extremely important, especially for you people who are Atlantean researchers. The reason why that's important is because they are sometimes associated with the pre-Hellenic inhabitants of the region. Now that's interesting because back in the Atlantis stories, we have the ancient Hellenes are supposed to be the ones who defended against the Atlantean invaders. So does that mean that the Pelasgians are the prototypes of the ancient Hellenes? See, we can kind of start to piece together some of the actual history over there and the human migrations that took place around the area. Interesting. So if we try to put together a timeline, that means the Pelasgians probably would have existed after the deluge. They would have been a post-deluge or a diluvian people. So whoever the Pelasgians were, they scramble out of the deluge, they try to rebuild, and they do rebuild in the Mediterranean-ish area. Maybe, but that's the other thing. Did they migrate there over that time period? I mean, were they chilling in the Mediterranean area right after the deluge, or did they eventually show up there from somewhere else? So I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Just thinking out loud. Then that means that maybe the Pelasgians eventually turned into the ancient Hellenes, which then for some weird reason become the arch nemesis of the Atlanteans. And I have no idea why. Alright, that's enough schizobabble. We'll keep going with that later. So, going back to the Pelasgians and their origins. Alright, let's talk about their language. Now, the Pelasgian language is mentioned in some ancient texts, but it is not well documented, and that is our problem with all of this kind of stuff, right? It's the bane of all ancient researchers everywhere. We have like crap for documentation. It sucks. And there's no consensus on the linguistic affiliation. That is unfortunate for us as well. Now, some have suggested that it may have been related to other ancient Mediterranean languages, but this is all speculation. Like, we don't know. That's the problem with these people in general. We don't have enough information. And what kind of makes things worse, and we'll cover this a little later, I believe, is that the information that we do have, we're not getting this from original sources, right? The Greek authors that write about the Pelasgians, we don't have their original works. We have like copies of quotes of quotes. That's how bad it gets. All right. Anyway, let's keep going on. Now, where did they exist in the mythology? So in Greek mythology, the Pelasgians are sometimes depicted as the builders of ancient structures, including stuff like the walls of Mycenae and of Tiryns, which they were all considered like great engineering marvels of their time, right? These are all those mega structures. Now, this is an immediate point of contention. So the walls of Mycenae, they are considered cyclopean buildings, right? They are megalithic structures, and they're built, well, there's several different versions of the wall, the architecture. The kind of architecture that we find at Mycenae is extremely interesting and is probably our first main clue to see how old the people were back then. So in Mycenae, we find a tale as old as time that we find everywhere else on the planet in a lot of areas. What we find is megalithic architecture that has high degrees of engineering employed to put together huge blocks of stone without mortar and also retaining some sort of asynchronous configuration. Now, this style of architecture, this cyclopean architecture, is literally like the bane of historians and archaeologists everywhere. So mainstream thinks they have it all figured out. Oh yeah, they just kind of chiseled it, threw it together with copper chisels, and they were done. It's perfect. It's that simple, right? Okay, that's garbage, of course. We all know that. That's been scientifically disproved, so we can get rid of that. But then on the other side of the spectrum, of course, we have, the alternative research side that says aliens did it. for now, we will discard both sides because there's no evidence. Well, there's tons of evidence that goes against the mainstream, so we can flush that down the toilet. And then, of course, the hardcore alternative side, we don't, it's right now it's unfalsifiable. I can't just say aliens. But what we probably can say is that our ancestors back way in ancient times definitely had some other way of doing things. And so Mycenae is one of these examples. Now, these kinds of stones are found all over the planet. Don't forget that. And if people are willing to give the Pelasgians credit for these structures, for these Cyclopean structures, then it might be possible to also say that, hey, these guys were all over the planet doing these kinds of things, right? They were building these kinds of structures all over the Earth, which then kind of starts to muddy the DNA situation, and actually it starts to explain the migrations and DNA that we find all over the planet. But that is another story entirely. I'm not going to get into it. So did they build these kinds of structures? I don't know. But as I was talking about earlier, what we do see is we see various levels of building here. So we find the megalithic blocks jointed together perfectly without any mortar. And that is an impressive feat to be able to pull off that kind of architecture. Now, the next thing we find is we will find more rough-hewn blocks stacked generally on top of the Cyclopean blocks in a fashion that indicates that the rougher stuff comes way later than the Cyclopean blocks. Now, once again, we see this all over the planet, and there's a million videos out there done by amazing people who will be able to explain and show you more of this. So I don't want to go into that, but for our purpose here with the Pelasgians, it does appear that there may be some sort of a connection. Now, what is that connection? I don't know. Let's keep going. Let's keep exploring what else we can find here. So moving on, sometimes the Pelasgians are also occasionally associated with early religious practices and cults. Now, we'll dig around more to see what we can find with that as well. Now, where were these guys located? Where did the Pelasgian people generally exist? The term Pelasgian is not limited only to mainland Greece. It is sometimes referred to the ancient peoples in other various regions of the Mediterranean, including parts of like Asia Minor and Italy, for example. Now, this has led to some confusion about whether the Pelasgians were a single unified group or a collection of diverse regional peoples. And that's our problem, right? We see a lot of the same stuff that are described as the Pelasgians, described all over the place, really. So right now we're focusing on the Mediterranean, we're focusing on the Pelasgians, right? This seems to be a Mediterranean term. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems to be more of their story over here. But that doesn't mean that they were local to here. The Pelasgians could have very well have been known as something different elsewhere across the planet. For all we know, it's possible that maybe some of the Pelasgians or a sect of the Pelasgians eventually would become what we would call Atlantis. I don't know, but it's entirely possible, right? We know that there are people that split apart over time, and it's entirely possible that at some time in ancient history, I mean like way ancient history, that the Pelasgians split up into various tribes or countries or peoples or whatever you want to call it. Hey, maybe that's why they actually didn't like each other, the ancient Hellenes and the Atlanteans. Maybe there was bad blood because they'd split up for some sort of reason back in the day, and now they're pissed at each other, right? Because the Atlanteans come out swinging at some point in time, although it is said that the Atlanteans come attacking the ancient Hellenes with no provocation, but we don't know. We don't have proof of that. Now, this brings us to their historical existence within these stories. Now, as I've already said, we don't know for sure if it was just one solid group that hung out together, or if it's a group that split up into many other groups. This apparently seems to be one hell of a debate with scholars right now. Now, I don't have a chicken in this particular fight, but I do think it is interesting that if you have catastrophes going on during the times of when these people existed, I could very easily see people being split up. Not just because of, say, political turmoil or cultural differences ultimately. No, I mean like literally, other catastrophic physical landmass separations could have taken place, which would have been more than enough to create multiple divisions of this people as they were forced to spread out across the planet. And of course, it wouldn't just be the Pelasgians spreading out across the planet, right? You'd have other peoples as well dealing with this. So who knows what could have happened during those periods of time. Now, I think it's important to remember that whatever catastrophes would have happened during this period of time, there was no moon around. So that means that the Pelasgian people were probably the people who existed once the Saturnian configuration had been broken, but Earth had not probably yet settled into its orbit in any shape or form yet. That means Earth's gravity would also be a little different as well at this point in time, which then could lead us to believe that the Pelasgians may have been semi-larger people. Which then would explain why they would be able to do and move some of the blocks around that they do move around. Okay, yeah, that can get crazy, I understand. Let's keep talking about what they say about the Pelasgians. We can get a little schizo later. Yeah, we'll wait till later. Alright, so some scholars argue that the term Pelasgian may have been used by later Greeks to refer to various pre-Greek and non-Greek peoples who inhabited Greece before the arrival of the Hellenes. So at least some of mainstream is on our side when it comes to that. Others are suggesting that the term may have been a catch-all label for various indigenous peoples. Both sides of that argument make fine sense to me. Which then leads us to what the hell happened to them? They're gone, right? Or they were eventually, I suppose, folded into, the ancient Hellenes, possibly. So here's kind of the general gist. So as the Hellenic civilization grew and expanded in the Aegean region, the influence of the Pelasgians gradually declined. So the Hellenes, who spoke Greek and had a distinct culture, different from the Pelasgians, yeah, that's interesting, became the dominant political and cultural force in the region. So then, over time, the Pelasgians seem to have assimilated into the broader Hellenic culture, and their distinct identity and influence faded from all of our historical record. Now, I don't see anything wrong with that explanation. The only thing that we're missing, I believe, would be all of the crazy stuff that happened to change that culture, right? So they're not talking about any kind of the catastrophes that the people back then had to deal with, or just the basic Earth situation in general that the Pelasgians would have been dealing with, right? So if this is, and it probably would have been, post-Saturnian configuration, Earth would be in a very interesting situation at this point in time, right? Because you're still dealing with the fallout of Saturn novaing, and most probably at this point in time, their sun, quote unquote, would be Jupiter. So Jupiter would be their main star in the sky, whereas our real sun, the bad sun, that's only now slowly coming into play. So they would have been a Jupiter cult more than likely. Oh, I should go down that path. Let's see if they did worship Jupiter. But first, I want to share what I found here. Okay, so check this out. Remember how I said that at this period of time, it would have had to have been post-Saturnian Nova-ing situation, right? So Saturn is already starting to fade off into the distance. That would make Jupiter the main star at this point in time. That would be what's kind of keeping Earth warmed up until we get, captured by the sun a few thousand years after that. So that also means that gravity would have been different back in the day, which means that we would have had all the mega animals and stuff living at the same time as the Pelasgians. Now, I mentioned that the Pelasgians might be a little bigger, and I wanted to move on, but guess what? I actually found that they translate it as tall people. Check this out. And I quote, "A proposed ancient etymology links Pelasgo, white, to Pelargo, stork, and postulates that the Pelasgians were actually the stork people and or tall. In the Macedonian languages, Pelasgian also flexes between Macedonic pelican, of the pelican bird, and velikan, the great, and or tall, big, in plain Macedonian." See, I love this stuff. So just right here in this show, right? We just follow catastrophism. We follow the general timeline of what we kind of have and what we know Earth went through. And I postulated that the Pelasgians might be larger people, right? They might be a little taller because the gravity on Earth was physically different back then. And sure enough, even mainstream scholars are already translating the Pelasgians as tall or large people. So, alright, we can get a little schizo here. So, there's a problem with ancient history. The further back we go, what we find is gigantism. We find larger animals of all scales and all shapes and all sizes, mammal, reptilian, etc. Everybody's large back in the day, but nobody wants to think that humans were larger. Now, this traipses down the whole giant, pathway, that whole wormhole of giants living back in the day, etc. But if we're honest, just doing a little bit of scientific questioning here, we just found, without even expecting it, people are already translating the possibility that these guys were larger people, and that the Greeks knew about these guys as larger people. And of course, if the gravity was different during that period of time, post-Saturnian, pre-Venus event, and in the middle of the Jupiter configuration, we would have had larger people. And sure enough, there it is. I love it. In fact, let's have some more fun. So let's go talk about Atlantis really quick, right? So there are tales of the Atlanteans at least either being ruled by people of giant stature, or the Atlanteans themselves generally being larger. Now, when I'm talking larger, we're talking 7, 8, 9 feet, possibly some being up to 12 feet. Now, the Atlanteans would probably be on the shorter side, unless some of the older giants were still around. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but I'm only talking using science and historical record. There is no reason why a larger human couldn't exist during a time where gravity was less, right? That's what you would need. If you're rolling your eyes at this point, that's okay. I was once right there with you. The concept of giants or whatever, I wasn't on board with that until about 4 or 5 years ago, so I completely understand. But think of this. Dinosaurs, physically, like physics, you can calculate this, you can test it even. Dinosaurs could not have roamed the Earth at the size that they are portrayed as if the Earth's gravity was the same. So this is important. So we already have proof, even if you believe in the mainstream chronology of this planet, that Earth's gravity had to have been different at some point in time in the past, right? But what if that point in the past wasn't, hundreds of millions of years ago? What if it was only thousands of years ago, right? Maybe 7, 8, 9,000 years ago. Now, that's a different subject to touch on, and there is scientific evidence that does deal with that particular topic. But we're going to stick to the Pelasgians. I know I haven't really gone off topic, but whatever. Okay, so we're going to get back here. Pelasgians. All right, let's get back to the main subject. So, I guess at this point, we can say that we have proof that the Pelasgians were larger people. Now, this fact may coincide with all of those epic, amazing heroes that Greek mythology talks about that were like demigods. I'm not talking about the planetary bodies. I'm talking about people like the physical demigods on the ground that they had going from there, like Hercules, for example. People like Heracles or Hercules or however you want to pronounce it, these people, they did amazing feats. They were strong people, and they're always described as larger as well, right? And there's all kinds of these people throughout history. Gilgamesh, for example. Oh man, I wonder if Gilgamesh has anything to do with the Pelasgians. Oh, we're gonna have to dig around for that as well. I wonder if there's a connection. Anyway, so the demigods of Greek myth, they are described as taller men, great men of physical prowess compared to your normal human. I don't want to say your normal human nowadays. I don't know what humans were like at this point in time anymore. I don't know what to believe as far as that's concerned. But if these kind of people were descendants from a group of, taller, stronger, able-bodied people that lived during a time with lesser gravity, which means you could have grown larger, then that would explain the reality of where some of these stories might actually come from. And we could take this further. That would probably explain why we have people talking about giants either ruling Atlantis or being part of Atlantis to some degree, because they would have been the remnants of what was left as Jupiter, you know, breaks its orbit away from us and it starts to fade back into the background, and then the current sun that we have starts to take over, right? So the current sun that we have right now, that is called the bad sun in a lot of cultures, and the reason for that is, well, it should be fairly obvious, right? Nowadays, the sun is brutal on humans. I mean, there's no other way to put it, man. The sun is absolutely brutal on our current planet. Anyway, as Earth goes through all of those changes, a lot of the larger animals that used to be able to exist no problem, they all slowly die out, and that includes the larger humans. Basically, the true giants went extinct. This was one of the main parts where they go bye-bye, right? So if the Pelasgians were that, it makes sense that the main ones would have died out anyways, even if for whatever reason they could live forever. They wouldn't have lasted too long due to Earth's current cosmological situation, so they would go away. B, they would start to fold into other cultures, etc., right? So we know that these larger people mated with other people all over the world, and that's probably exactly why we see the kind of genetics that we see nowadays. Anyway, so they would just naturally fold into what would become the ancient Hellenes. Yeah, man. Huh. Interesting. Now, all of this started with me talking about Jupiter and how Jupiter may have related to the Pelasgians, right? So, Jupiter does play one hell of a large role in Greek mythology. So there's a good chance that Greek mythology was just a continuation of whatever the Pelasgian, well, not mythology, I mean, it would have been the history, right? So that's the history that just would have continued. And then, you know, over the centuries and millennia and all that stuff, obviously it's been scrambled all over hell and back. But yeah, I mean, that makes sense. That makes sense of that lineage in that area. Then you throw in the catastrophism stuff, which of course wipes out the knowledge, would have further scrambled the populations. The Atlantis subject is interesting because what if the people who eventually would found Atlantis over there, or maybe they were already over there, I don't know, but what if, you know, there is some split that happens between Pelasgian groups, and they eventually become the ancient Hellenes, and then the Atlanteans become the Atlanteans, and then you have one hell of a fight, and then you have the Venus event starting up, right? Very interesting. In fact, there's a lot more to this than I ever thought about. We are going to have to keep going on this, so I'm going to wrap this up here. I'll just keep going. I'll make another Pelasgian episode. Alright, so the next time we will dig into more Atlantean and giant connections. Screw it. I'm just going to go crazy with that. There's way too many connections here that we can't ignore, and well, I'd say both sides have ignored this. There's definitely more to the Pelasgians than I think is being talked about right now. We'll continue discussing this on the next show.